We're here on page Chaf Hey, and we're starting pretty much on the top. Hoyer L'Ruvain Shtei Karbanis Toda. Now, we said that there were different salvations that require gratitude and a chiyuv korban toda. So he has to bring two in this case. First of all, he was Yardei Ayam, he went down to the sea. And secondly, he was incarcerated in jail and he was freed from jail. So he has two korbanos toda. V'shachar et hakorban harishon l'shem korban hasheni. However, when they brought the korban, the Kohen had in mind at the time of the Shechita the nes of Yotzei Mibeis Hasurim, when that particular korban was designated for the nes of Yardei Ayam. Ein zu machsheves shinui kodesh, and the korban is ola lebaylim l'shem chiyuv. If, on the other hand, he had shechted it for the purpose of another person who had a miracle, who had a salvation, then we'll see that that is probably a shinui kodesh. Next, chatos chelev l'shem chatos dam. He was mafresh a korban chatos for a chet of eating chelev. Any violation of a chiyuv kares b'mezid b'shogeg generates a chiyuv korban chatos. In this case, he was mafresh his korban for the sake of a kapara for the shogeg of eating chelev. However, the Kohen Oved had in mind that this chatos is being brought for the purpose of achilas dam, a different violation of a different avera of a chiyuv kares. And here we have a sugya in Masechta Zvachim Adaf Zayin, and the Gemara there quotes a machlokes hamoraim whether or not a person could fulfill his chiyuv chatos for eating chelev b'shogeg when the Kohen had in mind that this korban was being brought for a different avera, like achilas dam. Is there a psul of shini kodesh? The Gemara quotes actually two opinions. And Rava is of the opinion chatos chelev, which ain't chatos dam kshera. Rav, on the other hand, later on in Tzvach Madaf Tes, is of the opinion psula. Now Tosfos says that this machlokes about chelev l'shem dam only applies if the Kohen Oved had kavana for a chatos of dam, and the Bailim ate chelev, and they were not guilty of the avera of eating dam. But in a case where the Oved, the Kohen Oved, had a kavanah l'shem chatas dam, and the Bailim were definitely obligated in a chatas dam, then everyone would agree in such a case that this is a machshava poselis. So that, and again, this is the same principle that we've been repeating over and over again, that lav bina lo machripa, meaning that if you have a machshava that's out of the whole league, it's out of the whole constellation, that's not a machshava poselis. So we have two scenarios, and we have to distinguish between them. In one scenario, the Bailim were not mechuyev in that korban at all for that avera. They didn't commit that avera. So that the Kohen had a machshava that's out of the whole league. It's out of the constellation. It was a chatos, which the Bailim were not even obligated to. So such a machshava doesn't register, according to one Mandion. But in a case where the Bailim actually were chayv a chatos dam, and yet the Kohen Oved had in mind a different Avera, then in that case, everyone would agree it's possible. That's a real bona fide machshava poselas, because you're talking about two different karbonos, and in fact, the Bailam were obligated in these two different karbonos, and he had a machshava for the wrong carbon. Now, if a chatas chelev l'shem chatas dam is psula, what about the following case? A carbon asham for one particular chait, and the Kohen had a machshava for a different chait. Is that called a shinui kodesh, which means that the carbon is kosher, but it's not ola l'bayim l'shem chovas? And it has the same din, as we're going to compare asham and chatos. Now, what happens in a case we had a machshava for a carbon chatos, for a chet of a chelev, and he actually ate chelev on Sunday, but he ate chelev again on Monday? Both cases were shogeg. It was the idea between them. And the Kohen Oved had in mind the achilas chelev of Monday, when this carbon that's being shechted now was designated for the achila of Sunday. And once again, we're going to consider it as a shinui kodesh, because they're two different averos, even though they're the same conceptual categorical averos, but they're two maisa averos, one of Sunday where he ate chelev, one of Monday where he ate chelev. And the carbon is kosher. And now the issue is it ol l'baylam l'shem chova? Meaning, at least he now has covered himself for Monday, for the achil of chelev on Monday, even though he had designated this carbon as a carbon chatus for his achil of chelev on Sunday. But now, through the machsheves hakohen, for Monday's achilus chelev, he now is ola l'bayim l'shem chova for Monday's achilus. But it seems to me, if I understand this correctly, he still has a chiyuv for Sunday. Now, what about a shinui from a carbon chova to a carbon nidava? For example, a carbon ola is classically a carbon shabab nidava. The Kohen was bringing an olas chova, let's say, for example, a yontif carbon, which you're chayav. But he had in mind l'shem olas nidava, as if the Bailam had voluntarily designated this carbon ola. And here he quotes apparently the Rashash, who says that im chishev al olas chova l'shem olas nidava, that's called shini kodesh, which means again the carbon is kosher below ola l'baylam l'shem chovasam, because the Kohen had the machshava for a nidava, which is fundamentally different than a chova. So he hasn't been, the Bailam hasn't been yotzei his carbon chova. He's going to have to repeat and replace the carbon with another carbon. Now, what happens in a case of a shinui from two carbonos that are very closely related to each other? Like if you recall yesterday, we discussed a carbon toda l'shem shlomim, or shlomim l'shem toda. We're going to give another example of two carbonos that are very similar. They're both technically a carbon shlomim, and he had the wrong machshav from carbon A to carbon B. What's the case? Kivsei atzeres l'shem shlomim. On Chag HaShavuos, the Torah commands us to bring a whole entourage of kvasim, of lambs. And they have the status technically of shlomim. So chishev v'kivsei atzeres shehem shalmei tzibur b'kodesh kadoshim l'shem shlomim shem kodshim kalim Be'em shel yoch. So we're talking about shlomim and shlomim, but they're two radically different shlomim. First and foremost, the shlomim of kivsei atzeres are not obligatory upon any individual. They are shalmei tzibur. And the Kohen had in mind l'shem shalmei yochim. But the difference between these two shlomim is much more far-reaching, because the status of shalmei, of kivsei atzeres, is kodshim. They can only be eaten in the azora, whereas the shlomim, in general, when anyone brings a korban shlomim, that's kodshim kalim. Therefore, in this case, where he had in mind kivsei atzeres l'shem shalmei yochid, it's considered shinui kodesh, and he would have to, the tzibur in this case would have to replace those kvasim with another set of kvasim. Now let's talk again about machshava shinui bailim, which we said is a machshava poseles, when he has in mind a different person. He writes here, listen carefully, machsheves shinui bailim haposeles he be ofen shechishev lasa korban l'shem adam achar mechuyev biosa kapara shel hakorban shechishev ba ach im lo haya osa adam mechuyev bekapara zu ein hakorban nifsal bechatos ubishar korbanos ein hakorban nifsal bechatos. So imagine that Ruvain is chayav a korban chatos, Shimon is not chayav chatos, and the Kohen had in mind for the korban of Ruvain l'shem Shimon, like he's going to be zorik the dam of the chatos for the kapar of Shimon. Shimon's not even guilty of that avera; he's not even chayav a korban chatos. In such a case, the korban, even though it's a chatos, is not possible. The korban would only be possible in Shini Bailim if instead of Reuven he had in mind Shimon who's obligated in a korban chatos, because min b'mino machir. But if he had in mind, the Kohen had in mind l'shem Shimon who's not obligated in a korban chatos, that's min b'sheino mino v'eino machir, and the korban is kosher, even though we're talking about a chatos. Share korbanos, a korban kosher, the ol l'bailim l'shem over. So in a case of chatos, and the Kohen had in mind the wrong person, and that person is not chayav in a chatos, the korban remains kosher, but Ruvain, the Bailim, who's chayav in a korban chatos, is going to have to bring a different korban and replace the first one. In other korbanos, other than chatos, we go a step further. Not only is the korban kosher if he had a shini Bailim for someone who's not obligated in that korban, but the korban is ol Bailim l'shem chova. Chatos shechishev bo l'shem misha mechuyev chatos, hainu she'over avera mechayeves chatos, is nikra mechuyev kapar k'mosa v'nifsal hakorban. So when do we say that shini Bailim passes the korban? That's in the case of chatos, where he had in mind Shimon, a different Bailim, who's obligated in chatos. In other words, both Reuven and Shimon share the same chiyuv kapara of chatos, and the Kohen had in mind, in the case of the chatos of Reuven, that Shimon should achieve kapara through this korban. The korban is possible. Shinui Bailim in chatos from Reuven to Shimon, both of whom are chayav in chatos, passes the korban. Send it to the base, to the base hapsul. Now, the next principle here is very challenging. Shachtel l'shem misha eina mechuyev b'shum karma. So instead of shechting it on behalf of Ruvain, he shechts it on behalf of Shimon, and Shimon is not chayiv in a carbon at all. Is that a machsheva shinui aposelis? I would have said my knee-jerk reaction would be that that's not a shinui haposelis because Shimon is not chayiv in any carbon. He's not guilty of anything. So listen to this radical chiddush here. And it's based on the Rambam. Shimon is considered mechuyev karban. What do you mean Shimon is considered? He's not chayiv in a karban. Ein lecha adam b'Yisrael she'eino mechuyev b'kapara. Maybe he didn't do an avera. He didn't violate one of the various shasal lavid, the ramach lavid, but he definitely is guilty of some essay, of some mitzvah essay, some positive commandment that at some point or other he didn't fulfill the essay. So he needs kapara for the absence of fulfilling of an essay. That kapara would not generate a karban. If a person, for example, didn't take a lulav on Sukkot, he's not chayiv in a karban, but nonetheless he needs kapara. So when the Kohen has in mind the carbon of Ruvain to be mechaper for Shimon, that's considered a machsheva shinui aposelis, because Shimon likewise needs kapara. Maybe, albeit not for eating chelev or dam, but for non-fulfillment of a mitzvah's essay, because ein lecha adam b'Yisrael she'eino mechuyev b'kapara al mitzvah's essay sha'amar. 1 second, what's going on? We're talking about a karban chatos. A karban chatos is a machaper for a lo saseh, sheyesh bo kares, not for a mitzvah saseh. The answer is, again, a radical chiddush, she'achatos mechaperes gam al essay. We always say that a karban olah is mechaper on an essay. Now we're seeing a radical departure on the Rambam Shita is that even a karban chatos is mechaper on an essay. Is memela Shimon, because we assume every Jew is somewhere down the line is guilty of non-fulfillment of a mitzvah's essay. Shimon becomes a bar kapara as far as a chatos is concerned. For some unknown essay that we assume he violated with a non-compliance, non-fulfillment of an essay sometime during the course of his life. Pretty wild. Shachtel l'shem misha kfar godar safar nodar lahavi ola. If, on the other hand, Shimon took a neder to bring a karban ola, and that's a nedava, the Kohen had in mind shechting the chatas of Ruvain for the purpose of Shimon's voluntary neder for an ola. Ein zed nikra mechuyev kapar kamis. That's not a machshava posel. Why? Because the neder and the ola of the neder has nothing in common with the kapara of a chatos. a person voluntarily takes upon himself to bring a doron, to bring a gift to the Almighty, he brings a korban olah. That's not for kapara purposes. He's not saying, well, I violated this, I violated that. Now, you might ask, well, wait a second. We just finished saying that chatos l'shem Yisrael, she'ena mechuyev shum korban, is mechaper on a mitzvah saseh. So now in the case where he shechs a chatos for the sake of the olah of Shimon, Shimon certainly is guilty, like anyone else, of a violation, non-compliance, and non-fulfillment of mitzvah essay. Let the status of Shimon be mechuyev kapar kamoso, and the chatos will be mechaper on the essay. Shusha ola mechaper sal mitzvah essay bekapara gemura vilu chatos mechaper schak mikufya she'eno kapara gemura. Ulefichach eno tzarich es hachatos shehalo lemachar yavi olav yiskaper bo legamre al averas ha'es. Very odd. We're saying paradoxically that if a person, it's unknown to him that he violated an essay. We only know it because it's impossible that he didn't violate an essay. But there's no specific essay, and there's no korban that he's bringing for that essay, and therefore the chatos will be mechaper on that unknown, vague, abstract essay. But not so in a case when a person violated a specific essay, and not only that, he designated a korban olah to be mechaper on that essay. In such a case, the chatos really doesn't achieve kapara on that specific, well-known essay. For that, he has to bring a korban nidre olah, which he'll bring tomorrow. But today, his relationship to the chatos, when I say his, I mean Shimon is obligated in a nidava because he took upon himself a pledge to bring a korban olah on an essay that he violated. That status of Shimon has nothing to do, no relationship with the chatos of Reuven. And the chatos of Reuven is not a category of a korban that could effectuate a complete, total kapara for the non-fulfillment of an essay. For that, he has to bring a korban neder of an olah, the olas neder. And in that sense, what we have here is out of the ballpark, as I call lav mina machriba, because there's no common relationship here between Shimon's chiyuv kapara and Reuven's chatos. Reuven's chatos might have a general power to be mechaper on an essay, but not on a specific essay for which Shimon has designated a korban olah. He'll bring the korban olah tomorrow, and that'll grant him kapara for his essay. But he cannot be considered a miskaper through a chatos, because a chatos is not related to a kapara's essay for which a specific well-known essay for which he was mafresh a korban. Olah shechishev ba l'shem misha mechuyev olah. And we said that a machshava poselos and shini bailim is when they share the same chiyuv kapara. Here, we have Shimon who's obligated in a korban olah. And instead of having a machshava for Reuven's korban olah, the Kohen had in mind the machshava for Shimon's korban olah. That is shini bailim. They're both mechuyev kapara in the same way. They both, Shimon is mechuyev kapara kamosa like Reuven because Shimon has an obligation to bring a korban olah. Let's say, for example, Shimon doesn't know, he's not aware of the fact that he has to bring a korban olah. We find that only later. So at time T1, the Kohen shechted Ruvain's Olah on behalf of Shimon. And at this moment in time when it was unknown to Shimon that he's chayv a korban olah. Then we find out at time T2 that Shimon was mechuyev an olah way back when, at the time of T1. Therefore, gam in chishev ba l'shem b'she'enu yodea shechayev olah hareze nikra mechuyev kapara kamotza. The fact that Shimon at that moment was unaware of the fact that he violated an essay which generated a chiyuv olah, that's irrelevant. And ein lecha adam b'Yisrael she'eino chayev kapara al mitzvus aseh. Even though he claims, well, I didn't know that I was chayev korban olah. I didn't realize that I forgot to take the lulav. It doesn't matter. You're mechuyev kapar kamoso because there's some other avera unbeknown to you, some violation of an essay, because ein lecha adam miyisrael she'eino chayev b'kapar al mitzvos. And therefore, you're considered mechuyev kapar kamoso, and hence we have a shidi bayah. All right, I just want to spend 2 minutes introducing the next topic, which is called Machashvin me'avoda la'avoda. So in other words, at the shechita, let's say, for example, of a chatos, he has in mind that he's going to be zorek the dam for the sake of a different olah, of a different korban, an olah, shlomim, whatever it might be. And the question now is that called a zrika shelo lishma? Because after all, at the time of the zrika, he had in mind for the purpose of a chatos, for which the korban was brought. The problem here was the machshava of the Kohen at the time of shechita, when he thought that he's shechting it so that the zrika sadam will be l'shem korban achel, l'shem olah, or l'shem shalom. And that's called machashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Okay, then, so that's where we're going to stop for today. And Belinetta tomorrow will pick up on Machashvin Me'avoda